Hey there, everyone. It's just about afternoon for us, so I'll start with happy afternoon to all of you. I hope you've enjoyed all of the proceedings so far, and I hope we live up to what SIS has brought to the table thus far. What we'll be talking about today is amplifying impact through design. And we're going to talk about it in a bit of a fundamental level. But before we get started, again, thank you. Thank you all for being here. We're going to be calling on volunteers. So I'm planting the seed now so you brave folks can volunteer when the time comes. But before we get into anything you'll need to do, let's kind of talk about who we are. So this is us. Hi, I am Geoffrey Daniel. I am the Director of Strategy at Briteweb, and my co-host for this afternoon will be Jonathan Tsai, who is a digital strategist extraordinaire. And we come from a company called Briteweb. Well, let's switch sides and talk a little bit about what Briteweb does. Briteweb is a strategy agency that works with social impact folks, so nonprofits, people doing work for good, and trying to basically do good things in the world. I think a lot of you fall into those particular camps. We're not going to necessarily talk so much about client work, but what we're going to talk about is our process. So what this talk will be about is giving you a bit of our secret sauce, the stuff that makes our engagement successful. However, because we only have about 55 minutes together, and hopefully it's slightly interactive, so probably a little bit less, it'll be in a highly accelerated manner. So we'll go through our process, but very, very quickly. But our hope is that our presentation, which is pretty robust, is enough for you to take away and do some of the homework on your own if you feel so inclined, and perhaps lead some of your fellow folks through the exercise itself. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. We want this to be as interactive as possible. I often tire of hearing the sound of my own voice, so please, other voices are always great. Again, we will need volunteers. You'll know when that happens, but we're available afterwards. Jonathan and I will be available for the rest of the conference, and our emails are here if you want to reach out to us beyond that. So without further ado, let's talk about how we fundamentally think about content and design. So there's a couple fundamental pieces about thinking about design and content. And one of the principles is always design with what your users are thinking in mind. Content really resonates when it's centered on what users actually need to do versus what we want them to know. And what they need to do is oftentimes complete their tasks. They need to feel the satisfaction of actually checking something off. Like, I've done something, I've completed something, to make them feel like what you have offered on your website is useful to them. And how to go about doing that is sort of anticipating the answering of your users' questions. Anticipate what they'll think before they even think it, which is the best way to actually design content around their needs. Ultimately, as well, you want your content to feel conversational. You don't want to talk down to them, you want them to feel like they're part of a community. The best way often to think about it is you're having a housewarming party and you are the best possible host. So beyond having punch available, this analogy is getting a little tortured, you want them to feel like they're part of something and they're welcome in your home and your space. Lastly, you want to make sure your content is clear and concise. And this is the part where I go on a bit of a tangent. I promised Jonathan that I will not do too many of these, but I have a couple of tangents that I want to talk to you about. So when you talk about making your content clear and concise, I harken back to a time where we were working on a city's election website. And they were really, really depressed by the amount of turnout they were seeing in terms of their elections. It was around about 18 to 22%, which isn't great. So when we took a look at their content was structured in such a way that you would hear the history of voting throughout the city for the last, I think it was 100, 125 years as their home page. Clear and concise probably means, polling locations and who they'd be voting for come to the top of that pile, and then perhaps talking about the history of voting. But we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So what do we mean by content? Content can be a number of things. Content can be web pages, it can be blogs, it can be social media content, it can be videos, it can be podcasts. Content really should be considered more the vehicle of your message. So when you're thinking about it in that lens, all the rules we just went through apply. You want it to be as welcoming and clear and concise as possible, regardless of the format that it actually shows up in. So here is a bit of our process around how we do and how we define what good content is. First, we want to know the order. First off, order is super important. Please do not skip steps. You can't do 2, 3, and 1, 4. It always needs to sort of follow in this logic and this flow, because ultimately, fundamentally, it begins with having a good understanding of who your audience is and why they're coming to speak and interact with you. So the first step is absolutely knowing who your audience is. So at this point, hopefully all our volunteers are ready, and I'm going to pass you over to John.
Thanks, Geoffrey. So for this next part, we're really hoping we could be a bit more interactive, because we thought about the concept for this as more of a workshop, actually. And so if there's anyone that would like to raise your hand and let us know you'd like to kind of take part in an exercise, please feel free to turn on your audio, or you could drop something in the chat, and we could work together kind of on the fly in real time here. Okay, so I've got Rebecca Lehman. Hi, Rebecca.
Yeah.
So Rebecca, for this next exercise, I would like you to talk about who's your high priority audience for your organization.
So for the organization, I'm doing social impact for a drone company that's a startup. So our audience is actually construction and agriculture, but my audience is nonprofits and educators.
Okay. So it's interesting, that first of all, it's good that you have like these clear segments, right? Because it's not unusual for us to run into organizations that really have huge aspirations and are trying to really connect with everyone. And so we do hear sometimes people say, when we ask who's your audience, they do say everyone. But in your case, you've got these clear ideas of who they are. Now, would you be able to, do you have a clear idea of being able to describe them? Or is that something that you already have written down somewhere, or have a clear picture in your mind?
Yeah, so within education, reaching out to like people who run technology departments, so like the GIS or the tech folks within universities, but then also that's kind of a harder audience. So then there's also just professors who are teaching classes where they can use our software.
Yes.
And within nonprofits, looking for organizations that do have some sort of a focus on innovation and technology, and possibly, can actually utilize the software.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as you are, in this step, when you start thinking about wanting to describe the audience, we've got some kind of dimensions and attributes that we generally look at, right, to help really paint a picture of clarifying like how well you have this picture of your audience, right? So in some cases it can be about just demographics, like what age bracket are they, what occupation are they're in. So in your case, it is very defined by the professional streams, right? But in some cases, even urban, suburban, rural, like these all have these all have some influence in terms of how you actually connect with folks. And we generally ask, and we want to look at as well any technological preference that they have, because in your situation where it is more, let's say, professionally defined, there are certain standards that might be consistent across these different user groups. But in some cases, when we see more citizen-oriented or consumer-focused, that could be really, that could be much more of a diverse and broad set. And we look at also what types of, in terms of what technology they use, this can also impact how they consume content, right? Like especially with more and more folks on their phones, that could really affect how you think about your content and how much from how much volume of information you put out there to the nature of how that's put together creatively as well. And also, another deeper lens that we ask our partners and clients to think about as well is to think about your users and your audience, your stakeholders, kind of on a deeper level, as in terms of what drives and motivates them, also what frustrates and discourages them. So the purpose of this is really to paint a picture as much as possible for what their lives are like, right? So when you talked about, you are reaching out to, say, for example, professors, they've got very different motivations and drivers and, pain points than, let's say, the IT folks, right? Or other stakeholders that you might have. So as you work on each of these segments and audiences, you will start finding commonalities and also areas of difference between them. And so just one example that we wanted to kind of show you is for venture philanthropists, right? Like it's some cases we name them, we give them names so that to really help guide internally. Once you're putting content together, you could say, for example, is this something that Victor will find appealing, or does this help Victor? And it really gets people on the same page as to who a piece of content is for, or who are we designing a piece of communication for. And as you can see here, we've got some some attributes, whether it's demographic, technology, behavioral. These are all also informed by research, right? So whether it could be a combination of qualitative and quantitative, it could be a combination of secondary or primary. It's really about describing who your user is. And also just in terms of how personas are used, in some ways, some have argued that this potentially could oversimplify your user, but that's really that the intention behind this is really, again, around empathizing. Especially if you think about what works for people, what are people really looking for? Geoffrey talked about what users' needs are. It really goes back to this and really knowing what motivates them and how to best meet them. So for your situation, beyond the professional streams, once you look at other dimensions like, even location and also what type of tech and digital behaviors they use, you might start forming a clearer picture for your purposes as well.
Was that helpful, Rebecca?
Yeah, thanks for including me. I think just one thing I'm aware of is that there's definitely a difference between maybe who your demographic is and who you want to reach. And so seeing like, the venture tech bro is probably the mainstream audience, but maybe you can change that to appeal to a new audience that's more diverse and inclusive.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. We, as sort of mentioned before, work a lot in the social impact and not-for-profit space. And where personas are so helpful is that you get some of that centering or segmentation in terms of who you're looking to reach and who your impact is actually going towards. And when you're fundraising or trying to bring people to a fundraising effort, and while you're also trying to speak to the work you're doing, it is can be two separate audiences within one form of communication where things can get messy. So that's why you can serve a number of different personas in one sort of tool, but they hopefully are tailored so one enjoys the benefits of the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. All right, moving onward. So we now know who our audience is. We have a sense of who they are, what they're looking to do, and we've named them. They are a person we know. So we're speaking to someone as opposed to a rough list of concepts. So our next thing is defining their needs or thinking about why they're actually here in the first place. I love this particular diagram. It does so much work for me without me having to say very much, but it is an opportunity for me to do a bit of a tangent. I and we have worked for a lot of educational institutions, and the point of frustration is that even the basic step of actually enrolling in a university or college is sometimes obscured by the way universities and colleges tend to speak about themselves. When in one example, I was working with a staff person at a college, and she was having a hard time getting her own son enrolled, which speaks to how bad the problem is in terms of the mismatching in communication. So how do we go about avoiding this? So the first thing we actually need to do is define our user needs. Our users are trying to actually do something, and we often conflate what we're proudest of internally with what our users are actually here to do. And the thing is, if we actually give them what they need, they actually tend to stick around longer. So if you solve their problems or the thing they need to do early on in your relationship as it's forming, they tend to actually trust you, and they tend to move forward into your website or into your content and stick around to do more interactions with you. Content should always try to answer what the user is here to do. The journey of discovering who you are, it begins with actually answering their basic questions. And ask yourself, is this content actually necessary? This is another point where I'm going to do another tangent. We actually worked with a rehabilitation hospital. And the people who were coming to this hospital were either people who had a traumatic brain injury or were loved ones of people who had traumatic brain injury. And the reason, well, obviously the reason they came to the website is to learn more about that traumatic brain injury. And in the process of doing so, someone had decided that the president of the hospital should wander onto the screen, obscuring the entirety of the content, and then talk about the history of the hospital and why the history is so important. Don't do that. You're actually hurting your users by obscuring the stuff they're here to get and putting up a message about what you want them to learn. It is a mismatch of content around figuring out what our users' needs are actually. So this is a point where we'd ask for another volunteer, and we'll pass it back to John.
Are any takers out there? Anyone willing to have a bit of a chat and do some sharing about the work you're doing, especially with your users? Oh, yes, I see Savannah. Savannah's raised your hand. Thank you, Savannah.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, so for the users at the organization I work, there's a little bit of a divide. We have a couple different personas, but we work with big corporations that are getting rid of technology or want to spend money improving their social impact, as well as low-income people who need technology. So the needs obviously vary there. For the people getting rid of the technology, their needs are, they need somewhere for their technology to go. They have a bunch of old stuff or broken stuff that they no longer need. And then for our recipients, the need is that they need access to the internet and they need help with digital literacy, and they need access to actually a computer and those sorts of things. So we provide a variety of stuff based on what they need.
Mm. And okay, so thank you for sharing that. I think so. You've got kind of two different users, very kind of coming at the issue from different ends of the spectrum, right? So for the purpose of our discussion, do you want to pick one that you want to kind of dig a bit deeper on?
Yeah, let's choose the recipients, because it's usually the one we try to focus on.
Right. So in terms of how, so in terms of if you think about, let's say, you know, whether it's the website, I think maybe if we could frame our conversation in context of your website.
Yeah.
What is it? What do they want to do on that website?
So usually they either want to pay their internet bill or request access to a technology device, or to pay for, yeah, like a low cost technology. Okay.
And in terms of, so if we select one of those tasks, so let's say get access to low cost technology, you want to, if we've got that as a kind of one of the key tasks they want to do, why would they want to do it?
Usually it's because they want to be connected to the digital world and more in a better way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and so in terms of what users do on the website, like those certainly you've outlined two tasks that they typically do, right? So either it's paying the bill or accessing the technology. So usually we would those would emerge as kind of, let's say, the key tasks that they want to do on the website. And we would also want to look at some of the drivers that are kind of leading up to that. So if it's about wanting to pay the bill quickly, or wanting to if it's wanting to access technology that's close to them, if it's based on proximity, we would really want to understand what those needs are, like really unpack that activity, right? Mm-hmm. And in terms of how we can express that to how we think through that process and how it helps us capture the effectiveness of that feature for the website, we turn to tools called user stories, which really help captivate what that journey is for them and why they're doing it, right? And so even in terms of the phrasing of it, it is really going back to those two questions about what they want to do and also why they want to do it. And normally the what they want to do is pretty straightforward, right? Like you know the task and you just kind of identify the task. But oftentimes when you are looking not just at features like transactional features, but especially when you're looking at content, oftentimes users are not just somewhere to do a transaction, or sometimes they need to know a lot of information before they get to even doing a transaction. And the content really helps support that process. So when you say, as a blank, I want to blank so that blank, the phrasing really is around, as a, let's say, as a user of technology, I want to be able to find low cost tools or low cost devices so that I can connect my family, or keep my family, or keep connected to my family, right? So it's that second part about so that is oftentimes the tougher thing to get at. You know, it's really looking beyond why they want that device, or why do they want to pay their bill. It's or why, you know, in the case of the corporations that you mentioned, it's not just about where do they want to offload the technology for. What's the purpose behind that, right? Like, what's the benefit to them for wanting to do that? And really, once you understand that second part, which sometimes takes a bit of thinking through and further exploration, that helps you beef up your content to first of all know what to say. For example, for the case of the corporations and the organizations, one assumption I have is perhaps there might be some kind of tax implication or tax benefit for them, or some type of write-off, or something else. If you know what those benefits are, if you know what those drivers are, then by being able to surface those, you would want to say, okay, we need something in our content plan that addresses that need, besides just saying, how do you, what's the process of transferring your technology? So it's really speak to that deeper need as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful.
Is that helpful? Great. I'm glad to hear that. So to kind of fill out this example, so going back to kind of the previous example we had about Victor, our persona, who was this venture philanthropist bro. If we were to apply that same framework for him, it would come out written as a venture philanthropist, I want to see proof of innovative thinking and measurable results, so that I know if an organization shares my mindset and is deserving of his support and funding, right? So when we were looking at this, again, this was done through research. This really speaks to, first of all, from a content perspective, having things like case studies, having data on the website, featuring results. So it's not just about, what an organization wants to do or what the intention is, but here is already some proof, some evidence, and something hard that they can wrap their heads around, right? So it's, again, going back to trying to connect back to those personas as well, understanding what their behaviors are like, if they are data centric or what appeals to them, then trying to tie that through to this end as well in terms of the user story. Was that helpful for you, Savannah?
Yeah, that is super helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for participating.
Of course.
And so the next step in the process, once you've started looking at, you've defined some a persona or some personas, some potential users and audiences that you want to engage with, then you understand what their needs are, whether it's from kind of a transactional need or informational need. You can start creating an outline. So in terms of what content looks like, you could start, again, thinking about what their needs are, what the tasks are, and start forming your plan that way, right? So again, with the goals and tasks in mind, you could start writing out some questions that users would ask to meet their goals. And in terms of putting them in logical order, sometimes it could happen through a sequence of events, like a certain journey that users go through, or sometimes an organization will design a process that, for example, to that case that Savannah mentioned, for an organization who wants to transfer the technology, there's likely already a process that is in operation that the organization would want to keep maintaining and working by, right? So having those types of frameworks in mind will help you put some structure behind content. And using these questions, you could start formulating both content and actually, especially from a design perspective, some features. Sometimes, if a website needs to do certain transactions or provide certain functionality for users, that could emerge as well. So in terms of an example for this, user journeys can help structure this content, right? So as an example of a user journey, this is a hypothetical. If a user was to, let's say, learn about a service, then do a trial for the service, then next would be for them to learn about the association behind the service. And then the intention is for them to join the association and become a member. And once they're a member of that association, they would, hopefully keep renewing their membership and be in this virtuous cycle here at the end, right? So every organization likely has some type of journey. So for that example that Savannah brought up about her organization, there would be likely two key journeys, one for the organizations that are transferring technology, and also another one for the individuals who are accessing that technology and accessing the services, right? And so as you think about who your personas and audiences are and what their journeys are like, you can think about, we talked about, Geoffrey talked about like their goals and their needs. Oftentimes questions come out that you might already know that they have, or that people keep asking. Sometimes, I think a handy way to know this is speak to your colleagues who are on the front lines, who are in touch with your stakeholders. They likely can rattle off very quickly what are like the top 10 frequently asked questions they get, right? From people contacting them by email or phone or what have you. And once you start mapping, and this type of framework really helps you understand how to start mapping out content. And sometimes this is helpful for uncovering some areas that are that you might actually be light on. Sometimes this is also helpful when you realize, for example, where the bottleneck is for your organization. Like what's blocking progress for your organization. For example, if it's about, you need more members in this case and people aren't joining the association, then you would look at that specific phase of this journey and really try to do a deeper dive into the content supporting that and leading up to that as well, right? Like, are we doing enough? Are we addressing the right questions? Do we even know, are we aware of what the questions are for those specific stages, right? So this is an interesting way to, this can be a very useful way to really understand what the system is like, and also what steps really need your attention from a content perspective.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll take it over from here. So the next step is producing web content using best practices. And I know saying the words best practices is immediately incredibly boring, but the idea of best practices isn't that we rob you of your creativity when it comes to content. It is to ensure that your folks walk away with what they need at the end of the day. So what do I mean by that? So this is the inverted pyramid of content. And it basically breaks down content into how you should be setting up stuff on a page. So most important, least important, and most important, less important, and least important. So if I'm going back to the elections example that I used a few slides back, we should probably start with candidates as they are the most important. Polling locations becoming less important, but still important. And then the history of voting, the stuff they use at the top of the page, should be lower down the page for people who are sticking around to read through everything you have to offer. And the reason why you structure content that way is because people read differently online. They don't tend to read like they read books. This is no surprise to any of us, but most people will skim the first paragraph of your information and decide whether it's worthwhile to continue. And that is more so true on mobile than it is on desktop viewing. So it is imperative that our first chunk of content is the most important thing to grab our actual users. So if I'm going to use an example, I have a lemonade stand and lemonade will be $2 a glass. My less important content, my lemonade stand will be staffed by adorable nieces, and my least important content is the lemonade stand proceeds will pay off my mortgage. So that is likely how you want to actually structure content to get people to not just read first paragraph, but keep going throughout. Next is page titles. Page titles should actually do half the work for you. You want them to be short and descriptive, and avoid internal acronyms or internal language of any sort. You want them to be welcome and inclusive to folks who don't necessarily know who you are. It is basically your introduction to them in a lot of ways. Also, these titles end up being used by Google in search, so you want to make them task focused and actionable, so people, when they find them in search, immediately want to go to your web page itself. Writing useful headings. So again, people read content on a web page differently than they do in any other form or medium. We are more likely as web page consumers to scan a page as opposed to read it through entirely. So headings basically break up your content into actionable chunks. So you can sort of skip through if a user is looking for something more particular. So action words such as where are we located, who we are, why our product is important, are great actionable headings. Also, a brief word around accessibility. Headings help people who have visual impairments sort of move their way through your content more easily and with less frustration. So you're not just helping, you're helping everybody by making sure that you use headings properly. Breaking up walls of words. I think all of us have had the experience where we have come to a web page and just been inundated by just a wall of words, just an overwhelming block of text. Don't do that. What you should be doing instead is trying to breaking up your content into paragraphs, one idea per paragraph, which is digestible. It also helps folks where English is a second language, or whatever, or not necessarily English, if you're globally, whatever language you are using. There may be other folks who are using Google Translate to try and move through because your product or thing is important to them. So one idea per paragraph helps those folks as well. You want short sentences and paragraphs. I am currently enrolled in an MBA program, and I am constantly being reminded by folks like Jonathan that writing like an MBA is the worst possible thing you can do for people, for writing content for human beings. So you want short sentences and paragraphs, headings, and bulleted lists. People love actionable bulleted lists. Your content should be structured like a web page and less like a VCR manual. I hate using that term because it immediately dates me, but moving on. Don't do this. Like, don't. Nobody wants to see this. It's gross. Don't ever do that. So in summary, to actually build out good content, you really need to know who your audience is. You really want to actually define what their needs are, and think of this as coming from a place of empathy for these users. A lot of you folks are doing good out in the world, and that empathy that chose you to be, why you chose that level of empathy when you decided what you were doing, take that empathy and place it back into your content, so people can feel that choice of you being here and doing this work and empowering the world in a lot of ways. Create an outline and produce content using web best practices to make sure you don't lose them and make sure they actually consume everything you have to offer. We made it through everything. Are there any questions at this point?
Is there anything, are there any parts of the session that perhaps you would want to dig a bit deeper into, or perhaps go back and if you wanted to apply some of that thinking towards your own organization or towards your own situation?
Hi, yes, this is Tanisha Rush from Fifth Third Bank. And although I'm not working on a project that's for a website, more so doing an impact report that we can share with our internal and external partners, I think a lot of the strategies that you outlined today really helped me to rethink the way I should go about doing it. So thanks a lot, gentlemen.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you're able to take something away from it. I mean, I think although Geoffrey and I, we come from mainly kind of that digital place, like we work on digital products and websites and whatnot. Yeah, it's totally that point that you mentioned, and Geoffrey brought that up too. Like, content is not just digital, right? Like, it could be a report, it could be any type of communication that you put out there. So really understanding who it's for, what they want to get out of it, and not just what you want to say. Really trying to finding that the middle slice of that Venn diagram that we showed earlier. Oftentimes it's not easy. Been in situations where that the sliver, the overlap between those two diagrams is very, very thin, because the company the organization had its key messages, its strategic priorities that it wanted to get out there to the world about its mission, or what it stands for, or what it wanted to say. But what folks wanted to hear from the consumer side, the investor side of things, were very different set of topics. And in some cases, there were, let's say, legal or regulatory constraints that prevented the company from really answering a lot of questions that stakeholders wanted to address. So thank you for sharing that. It's certainly it's kind of a media agnostic approach that can work.
I will second what Jonathan has to say there. I feel like, especially for reports, you can be even more strict, I suppose is the word I'd use, in terms of who your audience actually is, because you have a lot of information around who those folks are and what they want to get out of this report, whereas websites can be slightly more general. Reports are really, really targeted. So thank you for finding some use out of this, and those personas, lean on them. They could be your best friends when it comes to writing really, really great, impactful reports.
And I'm just watching chat, by the way. Please feel free to add questions to the chat. You could post it to the whole group or to Geoffrey or myself directly, and we can address it on video here. So one question that came that just popped up is what are some of the tools to analyze the demographics of your audience? So you could address that in a few ways. I think one is that if you already have, a database of your contacts and your stakeholders, that is certainly kind of the truest source of information, right? Like, if you haven't had a chance to kind of dig into that and mine that a bit, that will give you a lot of information, and it addresses right away, location. In some situations as well, there are services out there that, based on location, you can even triangulate and kind of forecast like what the what household income is like even. And so that is one, if having that your own information can be a very good source of truth. Otherwise, if you are let's say just starting an organization, or you don't have a robust list of contacts and in the database, you could basically start looking at who you want to reach, and start looking outwards and using tools such as even advertising tools such as the ones that Google and Facebook offer. Those could also help offer some potential ways of getting some more demographic information.
I would like to shout out Elena, who led these tips for redesigning government websites. Working within the bureaucracy of government can be very, very hard, and these tools can become so difficult to push forward when there tend to be so many folks at the table. And solidarity to you. I have done that heavy lifting as well, and if you were still in that space, keep up the good work.
There's another question here. that as a question about around CSR, DEI commitments, how could those be displayed or shared on the website?
John, do you want to take it, sway that, or I can?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of where those sit, I think a part of it depends on like what's the overall plan for the website, like what's the overall purpose of it, like is CSR and DEI, are these commitments supposed to be central? Like sometimes some organizations are really, hanging their hat on those policies or that approach. Because that will help dictate where on the website it goes, right? If it is very central to the identity of the organization, then you would want that to be somewhere high visibility, where you feel that you want to again think about that user journey, right? Like when someone comes to the website, where are the most likely places they will go, and where along that journey will they be seeking out or caring about this type of information? If it is about if they are, let's say, trying to do their due diligence on an organization and making sure that they are abiding by certain policies, and perhaps put it in that section. Or perhaps if it is a new initiative that you really want to promote and publicize, and maybe even having it on the homepage, right, might be the right place for it. So it really comes back down to, I think, two questions. Like one is, what's the organization's prioritization of this? Like where does it fit in the big picture? And also, again, thinking to the other half of that Venn diagram, how much do users care about this type of information? Because in a way, you don't want to get in the way of the user, right?
I'm unsurprisingly going to second what John said here, but I'm going to use an example. Our own website is going over a bit of an overhaul, and when it's core to our client base is how we operate with empathy and how we align ourselves with the values of the organizations we work with. It is kind of core to who we are, and in those cases, it is important not to segregate your copy. It is, as Jonathan said, it needs to live wherever it is appropriate and important. And so for us, for example, the fact that we are who we are and empathy is what we do needs to live in our case studies section. The fact of who we are and what we do needs obviously live in our about us, but it needs to be weaved in everywhere it needs to be important. And it may just be conceptually, your website needs to have that be more of its DNA and appear in several places or linked back to several places as opposed to just in one separate section. So think about, again, as Jonathan was saying, think about how that sort of that tale, that story about who you are, if that's important, is weaved into everything you actually do.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Also, scrolling through chat here. Oh yeah, there's another question, a related question. If there is dense text, for example, legal disclosures and the fine print, all that fun stuff, is that if there's dense text that has to be displayed, how best to get across? Does this stay the same or broken up into digestible bits?
Sorry, go on.
No, Geoffrey, please go take this one.
Happy to. So what has been helpful from a government context that I think certainly is helpful here is have that document in an accessible PDF in its entirety, but do the work for the user and break that up into again, digestible chunks, the things that are most important, the high level things that they need to know to get what they want from this document without reading it. And then if they feel the need to actually dive through, that document's contained somewhere else, but do the heavy lifting for them and pull out, as you say, the digestible bits first, and then give them the opportunity to dive deeper if they want to. They probably won't, but if they want to, they can.
Yeah, it's really going back to that question about, again, who is the user, right? Because again, in some situations you have And you know, it's not uncommon to see websites having to cater to more than just one user. And so if you've got, let's say, people who don't care about all the fine print and the legal disclosures, but you've got a small but important group that do care about them and are, you know, are looking for that, even the PDF to download so they could just read the whole thing for some light, you know, light reading. It's best to give options, right? You don't want to force all the users to have to read it, but then giving that choice can hopefully help address, you know, so you don't force people into reading it, but at least they have the option to do so. I just got a message that we've got only a few minutes until our session ends. And so just wanted to put the final call out for any other questions that you all might have, or any comments that you'd like us to address while we're here. Great. But oh, by the way, in terms of some interesting takeaways that you might find helpful, we've also put together just, you know, we pulled out a couple of these slides, hopefully to help you remind you of some of the approaches that we talked about today, for you to have in your toolkit.
Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate. This can be a dry topic. I think all of y'all made it fun. And thank you for your attention and your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Have a good day.